I got asked recently if I could do a comparison video on these two lenses. This is the Nikon AFS 14 to 24mm f2.8G lens versus the Nikon Z 14 to 30mm F4S lens. Now both of these lenses are very good lenses, but both do have some differences. Find out what they are next. This is actually going to be very interesting, and thanks to those who put in a request to see this video, because as an owner of these lenses, I've never really done a test on comparing, say, the old lens versus the new lens. So in this video, I actually learned quite a few things, and there was one thing that stood out that did surprise me. In this comparison video, I'm going to be using both these lenses on my Nikon Z7. It's a full frame 45 megapixel camera, and I'm going to have all the lens corrections turned on. I'll be using the Nikon FD-Z2 adapter to mount the 14 to 24mm f2.8G lens to the Z7. Okay, so let's start off this video by having a look at both these lenses side by side. You can see straight away there is quite a difference in size, with the Nikon 14 to 24mm being much bigger than the new Nikon Z 14 to 30mm. Now the reason for this is because of the release date. You've got to think about that time gap there in years. So technology has changed quite dramatically. But the 14 to 24mm f2.8G lens does have an internal zoom, whereas the Nikon Z 14 to 30mm F4S lens, it has a push-pull style zoom. All right, so let's zoom this 14 to 30mm out and see if there's any sort of difference in size then. We just got to unlock it, and I'll talk more about that soon. We just pull it out to, say, 14mm, and you can see now they're actually much more even in size. So even though they are both now pretty much close in size, there is a big difference in weight. The 14 to 24 weighs in at 969 grams, whereas the 14 to 30, it weighs in at just 485 grams. So that is a significant difference there. So there is one little feature on this Nikon Z 14 to 30mm that some photographers don't really like. I mean, it doesn't bother me too much. But what you do is when you collapse it, you push it down and it gives you more compactability when you're traveling and hiking. The problem is when you pull your camera out and you take off the lens cap and you want to frame up quickly, and if it's in this position, you get this message on your screen, so you can't really use the lens until you unlock it. So you've got to unlock it, push it out to 14mm, and then you're ready to go. At the time of making this video, this Nikon AFS 14 to 24mm f2.8G lens, it retails here in Australia anywhere between $2,500 to $2,700, whereas the Nikon Z 14 to 30mm f4S lens, it averages anywhere between $1,800 and $1,900. All right, so let's have a look at the difference in focal lengths, because they are practically identical in focal length. So I've done some video here with my Nikon Z7, and this is at 4K at 25 frames per second. At 14mm on both lenses, you can see they are practically both identical in video, but you will see when we switch over into stills, there is a little bit of a difference. At the max focal range of 24 and 30mm, the difference of having that extra 6mm of focal length on the 14 to 30mm does make a slight difference in allowing you to get closer to your subject. In terms of sharpness, I did some shots at 14mm using different apertures, and I used the same framing with the same subject. I only did my tests at 14mm because, hey, at the end of the day, the reason why you would have bought one of these lenses in the first place is because you wanted an ultra-wide angle lens. So I dare say you'd be living more at that wide end than you would at, say, the 24mm or 30mm mark. So now let's just step through those shots that I took of Yoda in the garden. On the left-hand side, you've got the Nikon 14 to 24mm f2.8. On the right-hand side, you've got the Nikon Z 14 to 30mm f4. Before I say anything, and this is the thing that actually took me a little bit by surprise, this is the one thing. If you look at the Nikon 14 to 24 on the left, it's actually cropped in a little bit. Both of these lenses are on 14mm here. Whereas on the right-hand side, the 14 to 30mm, you can see it is wider in the frame. You can tell down the bottom there, you can just see that garden edging a lot more clearer than you can on the left. So I'm guessing this is what happens to all the F-mount lenses when you use them via the FTZ2 adapter and you have all the lens corrections turned on inside the camera. You just get that slightly cropped in shot. So on the left-hand side with the 14 to 24mm, I'm at f2.8 and I pushed in and I focused on Yoda's left-hand eye. The same with the 14 to 30 on the right-hand side, I pushed in and focused manually on Yoda's left-hand eye, and I'm at f4. So let's just push in. Now, because of YouTube's compressions and all that type of thing, I don't know how this comparison is looking for you. So I'm gonna basically tell you what I'm seeing here on my screen on my Mac laptop. On the left-hand side, I can see the 14 to 24, even at f2.8, is slightly softer than the 14 to 30 on the right-hand side. I think it is a little bit sharper on that right-hand side on the Z lens. So let's push up into the corners at f2.8 on the left and f4 on the right. I would definitely give that to the 14 to 30mm on the right. It is much clearer, much sharper. Let me just push over onto the other corner. Now again, I think it is clearer on the right-hand side compared to the left-hand side with the 14 to 24mm. So let's try and even up the playing field here. Let's switch over to the aperture of f4 on the 14 to 24mm and compare it to f4 on the 14 to 30mm. So when we push into the center with both lenses at f4, you can see now they're both pretty much identical. The 14 to 24mm is looking much sharper. And it is, I don't know, it's almost a little tiny bit sharper than the f4 on the 14 to 30mm. Let's go up into the corners. So at f4, I still think the 14 to 30mm is much better up in the corners compared to say the 14 to 24mm over on the left. You can see it's quite soft, whereas the Z mount lens is much clearer and much more sharper. Same story on the other top right-hand corner. I think the Z mount is a little bit sharper than what the 14 to 24mm is. This is at f5.6. Let's push into the middle. At f5.6, I think they are pretty much the same, although again, I think it's actually now a little bit sharper on the Z lens on the right-hand side compared to the left-hand side with the 14 to 24. Let's go up into the corners and see if we can see any sort of difference. Although the 14 to 24mm is now looking much better, I think the Z mount lens is still got it well and truly above the 14 to 24. You can see it is much more clearer and much more defined and sharper. Same goes for the other corner as well. I think that Z mount lens, the 14 to 30, does have a much more clearer and sharper image. Okay, so this is the frame at f8. Let's push into the middle. Even at f8, I think the Z 14 to 30mm does have just that slightest bit more sharper type of image quality, because you can look at the wrinkles on Yoda's right-hand eye here, and then look over here. It's much more clearer and more defined. It's not to say that the 14 to 24mm is bad, but it's just that you can just get that little bit more crisp, sharper type image quality from that Z mount lens on the 14 to 30. So at f8 up in the corners now, they're looking very close. However, I still think the 14 to 30mm has that little bit more definition, and you can see that the colors of the fence, it seems to be darker on the 14 to 30mm on the right. Again, just like it was on the left-hand side corner, I think on the right-hand side corner, they're pretty much exactly the same. So at f8 in the corners, they're starting to get relatively close together. Finally, this is at f11. Let's push into the middle. I mean, they are very close, but I still believe the Z 14 to 30mm is just that tiny bit sharper than what the 14 to 24mm on the left is at f11. In the corners, again, they're very close in those corners, but still I believe the 14 to 30mm on the right hand side is much more clearer and more defined. Same goes for the right-hand side. I think they are very close again, but I still think that 14 to 30 millimeter on the right-hand side has that better type of image quality compared to the 14 to 24. The 14 to 24 millimeter via the FTZ2 adapter does make some substantial noise in autofocusing. And is a little clunky in focusing as well. Whereas the 14 to 30 millimeter is silent and faster in focusing. Now obviously this is much better for audio recording when you're close to the camera or using a shotgun microphone mounted on the hot shoe. So while I was comparing both of these lenses, I was thinking about the advantages one has over the other. And I guess with the 14 to 24 millimeter, the biggest thing is the fact that it has that 2.8 aperture. And that really does come in handy when you're doing things like astrophotography, you're in low light situations, and you do get that slightly better bokeh out of this lens. Whereas on the 14 to 30 millimeter, it's so much smaller and lighter, which is brilliant for hiking and traveling. And as my tests have shown, it is a little bit sharper in image quality, as well as having that 30 millimeters. I know it's not much, but I like having that little bit more on the end, just in case I need to zoom in that little bit more. So to the question, do you switch over from this Nikon AFS 14 to 24mm f2.8G to the new Nikon Z 14 to 30mm f4S? I've always said if you're running both an older DSLR and a mirrorless camera in combo like I am, then it's always best you hang on to the 14 to 24mm f2.8, because if you opted for the 14 to 30 and sold the 14 to 24mm, you'd no longer have a wide angle for your DSLR. The 14 to 30mm can only work on Z-mount cameras, whereas the 14 to 24mm can work on both. If you were moving on from F-mount cameras altogether and going to Z-mount mirrorless cameras completely, then I think it's worth sticking to the Z-mount lenses for those cameras, as they work better in video and they do get sharper results in most cases. I found they focus better and just work generally better all round when mounted natively to their respective Z-mount cameras. Now for those thinking it would have been better doing a comparison video showing the difference between the 14 to 24mm f2.8G versus the 14 to 24mm f2.8S lens, don't worry, I will be doing a video on that in the future. Anyway, there is some food for thought when you're thinking about switching over from this older lens to the new one. I hope this video has helped you out, and I wish you all the very best in terms of which lens you end up with. As I always say, never stop creating, and I'll see you next time.